Miss Marple and the Murder at the Lace Museum. Chapter 1. The village of Fallow Glen was not known for scandal. Nestled between soft hills and tangled hedgerows, its most pressing excitement was the annual gardener's show, or, occasionally, a misplaced delivery at the post office. But today the villagers had something grander to talk about: the reopening of the Lace Museum. It was an airy, ivy-wrapped building at the end of Mallow Street. Once the old rectory, now home to bobbins, samplers, and priceless antique lace from across the county, closed for months due to renovations and a curious funding dispute. Its reopening drew the polite curiosity of the villagers, and one, Miss Jane Marple, who had always found lace rather revealing in its way. So many holes, and yet everything held together. On the morning of the event, a crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of damp earth and chimney smoke through the village. The museum doors opened at 10. By 10 past, the exhibit room was abuzz with murmured compliments and the light clinking of porcelain cups. Miss Marple, dressed in a dove-grey coat and holding her handbag like a quiet companion, arrived precisely at 10:30. She accepted a cup of weak tea from the vicar's wife, murmured a kind word about the cucumber sandwiches, and took her place near the long display table of hand-woven lace collars. She was not the only one who noticed the tension in the room, only the only one who didn't ignore it. Standing near the main display was Mrs. Cordelia Fawcett, the museum's formidable curator. Tall, with the kind of rigid posture one associates with Victorian portraits. Mrs. Fawcett wore a severe black dress and a strand of jet beads. She greeted guests with clipped efficiency, her eyes flicking over their shoulders even as she spoke to them. Near the fireplace, Reverend Giles Maynard sipped his tea with visible discomfort. His wife, Dora, fluttered beside him like a moth that had grown too fond of lamps. Such a triumph for Cordelia. She whispered to no one in particular, especially after the trouble with the funding, you know. Edward Blake, the museum's financial secretary, stood stiffly near the refreshments table. His thinning hair was combed with discipline, and his gaze lingered just a second too long on the wine carafe, though only tea was being served. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a display in the corner. A framed sampler, its thread slightly faded, its letters carefully stitched. "Virtue is a lace that never unravels." She found it charmingly ironic. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sharp exchange behind her. "No, Agnes, that piece is not to be touched," Mrs. Fawcett snapped. Her voice was low but carried like the snap of starched linen. "You, woman," Agnes Bell, the museum assistant, drew her hand back quickly from a lace fan encased in glass. I was just straightening the label," Agnes murmured, face flushing. "It was crooked." Mrs. Fawcett's eyes narrowed. "These pieces are delicate. Your role does not include handling them. Please remember that." An awkward silence followed. The Reverend coughed into his sleeve. Someone poured tea a bit too loudly. Miss Marple sipped hers calmly. She noted the tremble in Agnes's hand, the slight twitch at the corner of Mrs. Fawcett's mouth, and the way Mr. Blake busied himself, polishing an already clean teaspoon. Something, she thought, had frayed beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, after the guests had wandered off and the museum doors were locked once more, Miss Marple walked home, beneath a sky turning the color of faded lavender. The leaves underfoot were crisp. She thought about the lace fan, Victorian most likely, but there was something unusual about the pattern. Or had it been the positioning? She brushed the thought aside. Perhaps it was only that Mrs. Fawcett had been unusually short-tempered. Or perhaps a sound interrupted her thoughts, a sharp, distant scream. It came from the direction of the museum. Miss Marple paused. A gust of wind stirred the hem of her skirt. Then, silence. She waited, listened. Nothing more. The village would learn the next morning that Mrs. Cordelia Fawcett had been found dead, slumped in her office chair. The cause? A sudden cardiac event, the doctor would say. Most unfortunate, but not uncommon in women of her age. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She'd seen the lacework. She'd heard the scream, and she'd noticed that the glass case with the fan had been quietly removed from the main exhibit by morning. Before moving next, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you crave more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. By 9 the next morning, the death of Mrs. Cordelia Fawcett had travelled faster than the milk cart. The notice was posted at the grocer's by 8:30. By 9:15, Mrs. Petherbridge was knocking on Miss Marple's door, breathless and damp with urgency, despite the mild weather. "Have you heard?" she asked without preamble, cheeks flushed like stewed plums. "About Cordelia?" Sir Marple, who had just sat down to butter her toast, gave a soft nod. "Yes, such a sudden thing. Quite distressing." "Distressing," Mrs. Petherbridge echoed, dropping heavily into the chair opposite her. "My cousin Enid was at the museum when it happened, you know. Says the body was still warm when Agnes Bell found her. Stiff in the office like a broken puppet. They say her mouth was open, like she'd been startled, not just gone quietly." Miss Marple offered tea. Mrs. Petherbridge waved it off, too invested now to pause. "Dr. Fulbright says her heart gave out, but I don't like it. Cordelia may have been a difficult woman, but she was always sharp. And you heard about the lace fan, didn't you?" Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "What about it?" "Gone. Vanished. They've removed the whole case. Agnes told Enid that Edward Blake ordered it boxed up before the police arrived." She lowered her voice, as if even the wallpaper might gossip. "And the fan was hers, you know. Cordelia's private donation. Had it since before she came here. Some say it wasn't quite legitimate how she acquired it." Miss Marple didn't reply at once. Instead, she spread a thin layer of marmalade across her toast. "I wonder what prompted such urgency." "Exactly." And Agnes looked like she hadn't slept a wink. The girl's hands were shaking when she handed over the museum keys. "Something's off. I feel it in my bones." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Bones are often more reliable than people think." By midday, the village air had turned brittle with suspicion. Small clusters of conversation dotted the high street like fallen apples. Bruised whispered over and quietly stepped around. At Cresswell's stationery and gifts, 2 customers murmured behind a rack of garden-themed thank-you cards. "I'm telling you, it wasn't natural," said Mrs. Goodwin, a large woman with too many rings. "Did you see the shade of her face? Not a heart attack. Poison." "Oh, don't be morbid," her companion replied, not convincingly. At the post office, Reverend Maynard stood rigid beside the parcel counter, brows furrowed as the clerk fumbled with stamps. "I'm simply saying," he muttered to no one, in particular, that Mrs. Fawcett was not the kind to overexert herself. Something must have brought it on. Stress, perhaps. She had enemies, you know. Back at the vicarage, Dora Maynard had already composed a list of potential motives and tucked it behind the pantry jam labels. just in case the police are inefficient, she told her husband. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a quiet visit to the Lace Museum that afternoon. The front door remained locked, but Agnes Bell was there, sorting paperwork in the narrow reception hall. Her eyes were ringed with sleeplessness, and her voice carried the tautness of someone waiting for a door to slam behind them. "I wasn't expecting anyone today," she said as she opened the door, unsure whether to be annoyed or grateful. "I won't stay long," Miss Marple said softly. "What I only wanted to offer my condolences. You must have cared for Mrs. Fawcett very much." Agnes hesitated. She was particular, but I respected her. Miss Marple nodded, pausing. "A great deal of responsibility has fallen to you now." Agnes's gaze dropped to the ledger on the desk. "Mr. Blake's handling most of it. Said I should focus on inventory." "Inventory?" Miss Marple echoed. "Ah, the fan collection, perhaps." Agnes blinked just once. "Those were her favorites," she said. "Each one told a story. And now the stories are packed away." Agnes offered a weak smile. "Mr. Blake said it was best not to overwhelm the inspectors." Miss Marple let her gaze rest on the young woman. "Did she have any visitors recently? Anyone not part of the museum board?" Agnes hesitated a fraction too long. "No, not that I know of." Miss Marple said nothing more. Instead, she reached into her bag, drew out a wrapped tin of currant biscuits, and placed it on the counter. "Something sweet. You look like you haven't had a proper breakfast." When she stepped outside, the door closed behind her with a sigh, as if even the building was tired of the murmurs. That evening, the local constable, Sergeant Webb, came to visit Miss Marple with a notebook too new for comfort. He was not from Fallow Glen, having been assigned from a nearby town only a month prior. He bore the fresh shine of procedural training and an unfortunate distrust of old ladies. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat, "just following up with key witnesses. Mrs. Petherbridge mentioned you were present at the museum event." "I was," she said, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Did you see anything unusual?" "Many things, Sergeant," she replied, "but nothing I would describe as officially suspicious." He blinked. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said gently, "that some people are often more revealing when they believe they're saying nothing at all." He frowned, unsure whether she was mocking him. "Well, doctor says it was a heart attack, clean as you like." "I'm sure he did," she replied, sipping her tea. Sergeant Webb flipped a page. "That Agnes girl seems nervous. You think she's hiding something?" Miss Marple considered. "I think she's afraid. That isn't always the same thing." Scratched the side of his jaw. "We'll keep looking into it. I expect it'll all settle down in a few days. I hope not too quickly," she murmured. He didn't ask what she meant. Perhaps it was just as well. By nightfall, rain tapped softly at the windows of the village cottages. In the darkness of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat beside the fire, darning a woolen cuff. On the table beside her was a folded newspaper, a tea tin marked chamomile, and a single matchstick, slightly scorched, yet unstruck. She glanced at it, then, very softly, she smiled. Chapter 3. By the third day, the official story had settled into place like poorly ironed linen. "Heart failure," the villagers repeated, not quite believing it, but unwilling to contradict the doctor. The more skeptical ones added, "Well, she was under stress," as if stress had become a suitable stand-in for murder. Miss Marple, of course, was not satisfied with neat explanations that ignored untidy truths. That morning, she made a quiet call on Mr. Edward Blake, the museum's financial secretary. His cottage was just past the village green, neat, symmetrical, and entirely devoid of warmth. Mr. Blake had a garden no one walked in, and a wife no one had seen in nearly a year, though rumour insisted she was recuperating in Bath. He greeted Miss Marple at the door in shirt-sleeves, a pencil behind one ear. His smile was professional and just slightly over-aimed. "Miss Marple, this is unexpected. I do hope I'm not intruding," she said, though her tone made it clear she knew she was not at all. "Just going over the donation ledger." He gestured toward the sitting room, but did not offer tea. The room was sparse and exacting. Books arranged by spine color, a clock ticking 1 second ahead of its echo. "I understand you've taken on quite the responsibility at the museum," she began, settling into the edge of the armchair. "Temporarily, yes," Blake replied, smoothing his shirt cuff. "Agnes is handling admin, but the board agreed I should coordinate the transition. It's all very sudden, of course." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Sudden things often are." He didn't respond. She let a brief silence stretch before continuing. "I've always found lace fascinating. So precise, so delicate. And yet the tiniest flaw can unravel the whole thing." Blake offered a stiff smile. "An apt metaphor. I notice the lace fan is no longer on display. It was such a lovely piece." Cordelia spoke of it with great pride. His smile thinned. "The fan has been secured. Standard procedure. Valuable items are withdrawn during police reviews. But she donated it, didn't she? Some years ago." A pause. "Privately, yes. There was no formal paperwork, but the museum considered it part of her legacy. Yet you packed it away immediately." Blake's jaw moved faintly. "We had no reason to believe it was relevant." "Of course," she said mildly, "though sometimes the most irrelevant things turn out to be the most illuminating." She stood. "I won't take up any more of your time. But I wonder, did Mrs. Fawcett ever mention feeling unsafe or threatened?" Blake looked briefly surprised. "No, she was quite firm on boundaries. She didn't concern herself with gossip or small threats. She was Cordelia." Miss Marple nodded, as if that answered everything. "Thank you, Mr. Blake." She left the cottage with more questions than she'd arrived with. The fan had been removed too quickly, the donation undocumented, and Edward Blake had been too rehearsed, too tidy, Miss Marple thought. And human nature, as she well knew, was anything but tidy. She made her way next to the vicarage, where Dora Maynard greeted her with the enthusiasm of someone expecting to be useful. "Oh, Jane, do come in. I've been sorting through the old church archives, trying to find that record of the museum's founding committee. Fascinating how things begin, isn't it? So much hope and then, well, people get involved." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "It's people who always spoil institutions." Dora giggled, then lowered her voice. "Between you and me, I never quite trusted Cordelia. Always thought she held the whole village in contempt. Even her compliments felt like sharpened teaspoons." Miss Marple accepted her tea without sugar and took a measured sip. "Did she have close relationships? Friends?" "Hardly. Tolerated some, dismissed most. She and Agnes were thick as thieves for a while, then something changed. A row about a display, I think. Cordelia said Agnes was getting ideas, said museums weren't for sentiment." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet sentiment is what draws people back. Dora leaned in. You know, the night before she died, Cordelia was seen walking near the allotments, alone. Edward said she was headed to the printer's, but the printer says she never came. Did she say anything to you at the event? Dora frowned. Only a rather strange thing, about lace. She looked at one of the older samples and said, "You can always tell the difference between what's handmade and what's cleverly faked." Then she walked off. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the handle of her cup. "How curious," she murmured. That evening, Miss Marple took a small walk to the museum grounds, now cordoned off with a thin rope the color of old bone. Rain threatened from the sky but had not yet fallen. She stood before the building for some time, her eyes drifting not to the main windows, but toward the rear, where a second-floor sash stood slightly ajar. The museum had no night staff. Mrs. Fawcett had insisted it was unnecessary, and yet someone had been there late. That much she was certain of. She turned back toward the road when a voice called out behind her, "Miss Marple?" Agnes Bell, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the weather, approached hesitantly. Her eyes darted once behind her, as if checking the street. "I shouldn't be here," Agnes whispered, "but I need to talk to someone who'll listen." Miss Marple offered her arm. "Then we shall walk together." Agnes didn't speak for a few moments. They passed a row of hedges before she finally exhaled. "I think Cordelia was afraid. She didn't say it out loud, not really. But she changed the locks last week, and she started keeping the fan in her office overnight." "Did she say why?" Agnes shook her head. "Only that things were getting messy. She said she'd made a mistake years ago, and it was finally coming home. Her words, not mine." "And did she mention who might come calling?" "No," Agnes said quietly. "But the day before she died, she told me not to trust Mr. Blake." They stopped walking. Miss Marple turned slightly, watching Agnes's face. "Then why haven't you told the police?" Agnes looked away. "Because I think I was the last one to see her alive." Chapter 4. The very next morning, Agnes Bell was brought in for questioning. It wasn't a formal arrest, not yet, but in a village like Fallow Glen, it didn't need to be. The moment Sergeant Webb escorted her from the museum office to the parish hall for a private word, the public had made up its mind. "Poor girl," murmured Mrs. Goodwin, already en route to the baker's. "But she's always been a bit odd, hasn't she? Very quiet, and always hovering near Cordelia. She was the last to see her alive," Dora Maynard told the ladies at the sewing circle, as if the knowledge had been hers alone, and she inherited nothing. "That's motive enough." "She didn't even cry at the funeral notice," added a voice from the back. "No grief, that's always telling." By midday, Agnes had become a convenient villain, stitched together from fragments of innuendo and strained glances. She had ambition, they said. She had opportunity, and she had something to hide. Miss Marple, however, was not one for fast stitching. She stood quietly near the back of the parish hall. As Sergeant Webb flipped pages in his notebook with more force than necessary, Agnes sat at the table opposite him, shoulders rounded like paper left out in the rain. Her hands clutched a handkerchief, but never used it. "I just want to be clear," the sergeant said, tapping his pencil. "You were the last person known to see Mrs. Fawcett alive, aside from Mr. Blake, who claims he left shortly after closing." "I was finishing the display logs," Agnes said. Her voice was steady but distant. "She told me to go home, that she had to check the safe." At what time? Just after 6. And no one else came in after? I don't know. I left through the side door. Webb scribbled something without looking up. And what time did you get home? Around 6:30. Anyone see you? Agnes hesitated. I live alone. He made a non-committal grunt. Right, from the back. Miss Marple shifted her weight slightly. The creak of a floorboard, the only indication of her presence. Webb leaned back. Miss Bell, there's something you should know. The coroner's report came in this morning. They found traces of digitalis, foxglove. Not enough to act fast. But over time, a consistent dose would be enough to mimic a heart failure. Quiet, untraceable, unless one knew to look. Agnes stared at him, blinking slowly. I don't even know what that is. It's grown wild near the allotments. You passed them the night she died. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. It was a subtle shift. How the phrasing had gone from, did she, to, you did. Webb continued. We found traces of it in the tea tin in Cordelia's office, unmarked, loose leaves. Agnes didn't speak. Then softly. She didn't let anyone touch her tea. That's not what Mr. Blake said. Miss Marple stepped forward. And has Mr. Blake offered any handwriting samples, Sergeant? Webb blinked. What? For comparison, I mean, on the museum logs, or on the shipment forms. I ask only because Mrs. Fawcett mentioned to Agnes that someone had tampered with donation records before. Webb frowned. That's news to me. Then, perhaps, Miss Marple said gently, you're asking questions in the wrong direction. Outside, Agnes sat on the stone steps, pale under the afternoon light. Miss Marple joined her, folding herself onto the edge of the bench with quiet ease. You shouldn't have interrupted, Agnes said. Now it'll look worse. I doubt it. You could look worse in the eyes of a village that's decided you're guilty. Agnes offered a humorless smile. People are so quick, aren't they? They liked me better when I was silent and useful. Miss Marple glanced at the path leading, away from the hall. People prefer stories they can carry in their pockets. You, I suspect, have always been rather too large for that. Agnes looked at her, uncertain. Miss Marple continued. You said Cordelia changed the locks recently. But Edward Blake claimed the fan was still on display the morning she died. Yet it was not visible during the reception. I wonder, did she perhaps remove it the night before? She did, Agnes said softly. She said she didn't trust the numbers. Thus was her phrase. Miss Marple turned that over. And yet she never explained what she meant. No, only that if anything happened to her, follow the fan. A silence fell. You think I'm being set up? Agnes said finally. I think someone hopes the village won't look too closely if you are folded neatly into the villain's role. Later that evening, Sergeant Webb knocked on Miss Marple's door. His notebook was missing this time. He looked tired, creased at the corners and slightly rain-damp. I don't suppose you have any tea, he said. I do, she said, and I steep it properly. They sat in the small parlor while the fire hummed faintly. Webb exhaled. I don't like it. There's something off about Blake, too rehearsed. And that ledger? I took a peek. Entries scratched out, then rewritten. A couple of checks misdated. You'll need the originals. I'll need a warrant. He muttered. Miss Marple passed him a biscuit tin. Then you must be patient. Sometimes the right mistake takes time. Webb looked up. You think Agnes is innocent? I think she's afraid and clever, but not calculated. Not in the way this crime was. Webb tapped his fingers on the armrest. "I've got half the village saying she was jealous of Cordelia, that she wanted control of the museum. And yet she didn't even fight to keep her position," Miss Marple said. "She let Blake take over the moment Cordelia died. That doesn't sound like ambition to me." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the story isn't quite finished. We've only reached the first misdirection, Sergeant. The clever part comes after." Chapter 5. The following morning brought grey skies and the kind of steady drizzle that turned garden paths to mud and made the postman curse under his breath. Miss Marple, however, found rain quite agreeable for thinking. She sat by the parlour window, knitting needles resting in her lap, her gaze unfocused, not on the garden beyond, but on a memory from 2 days past. The lace fan, briefly visible during the reception, and then inexplicably absent. A trifle, everyone thought, but Miss Marple had long known that in trifles truth often hid its face. She rose and crossed to her writing bureau. From a small stack of museum pamphlets gathered over the years, she extracted one from the prior season's exhibit, a catalogue listing notable pieces on loan and gift, dated March. She flipped through the brittle pages, pausing at an entry titled Fan Number 12, Black Chantilly Lace, Victorian Era. A note in Cordelia Fawcett's own hand. Donor, anonymous. Origin disputed. Likely continental. Curious. Mrs. Fawcett had always claimed the fan had been hers long before the museum acquired it. Why then note the donor as anonymous and origin disputed? The phrase seemed carefully chosen. Cordelia, for all her faults, had a librarian's precision. She would never have allowed such ambiguity into print unless she had a reason to protect the truth. Later that day, Miss Marple stopped by the grocer's under the guise of needing ginger biscuits. Mrs. Calthorpe, who ran the counter with a near-religious attention to detail, was only too happy to chat. "Terrible business, that museum mess," she said, weighing out a £1/4 into brown paper. "Though I never trusted that lace fan, you know. Bad energy." "Oh?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Well, when they displayed it in the spring, they put it right in the front cabinet. Then one day, it was gone. Just vanished. Back again, too. Weeks later, no explanation." Miss Marple's eyes flicked up. "Vanished." Mrs. Calthorpe leaned in. "Agnes told me it was for cleaning, but I overheard her in the shop saying it had been misfiled. Imagine that. Misplacing a thing like that. Priceless, they said." Miss Marple tucked the paper-wrapped biscuits into her bag. "Such things are easily overlooked, I suppose. Maybe. But that fan's got history, mark my words. Some say it belonged to a dancer. Others say it came from a French estate, confiscated during the war. That's why no one's listed as donor. It wasn't meant to be in anyone's hands." At 3 o'clock sharp, Miss Marple arrived at the Lace Museum, now reopened to staff and board members under limited hours. Edward Blake stood in the entrance, speaking with one of the trustees. His smile wavered when he saw her. "I thought this was a restricted access day," he said. "Oh, I'm not here to touch anything," Miss Marple replied sweetly. "Just to ask a small question." She gestured towards the back corridor. "Might we speak where ears are fewer?" He obliged, leading her to the rear storage room, dimly lit and lined with dusted shelves of boxed artifacts. "I was curious," she said, turning to face him, "about the fan. There seems to be some confusion over when exactly it was acquired by the museum." Blake's tone stiffened. As I mentioned before, it was a personal gift. Cordelia didn't want it formally recorded at the time, likely due to its value. Yet the spring catalogue calls the donor anonymous, and the origin disputed. Blake hesitated. That was her doing. She worried there might be provenance issues, stolen perhaps. That's a serious accusation. Miss Marple didn't blink. So is murder. The silence stretched between them. Blake's face betrayed the faintest twitch. She was looking into the fan's history, wasn't she? She continued. Found something she didn't expect. I wouldn't know. Miss Marple let her gaze wander to a stack of museum mail, letters still sealed in brown envelopes. Did she ever mention the name Lefebvre? His face froze, only for a second, but it was enough. She didn't, he said, which of course meant she had. That evening, Miss Marple invited Sergeant Webb to join her at the vicarage, where Reverend Maynard was indulging in his second brandy, and Dora had insisted on dusting around the clock as a way of thinking better. She thought the fan was stolen. Miss Marple told Webb in a quiet voice as they sat in the Maynards' conservatory. And she'd begun tracing its past. The name Lefebvre kept coming up, a French surname. Cordelia had written to someone in Dover who specializes in reclaimed estate items. Could be connected to war loot, Webb murmured, or private sales during the occupation. She kept that fan close in her final days. Slept with it, in her office, according to Agnes. That's not mere sentiment, that's fear. Webb nodded slowly. You think someone found out she was digging? I think someone needed the fan to disappear, Miss Marple replied, and Cordelia refused to let it go. The next morning, a museum intern discovered a burnt scrap of lace fabric behind the museum boiler. Charred, blackened, but unmistakably patterned. Miss Marple, standing beside Sergeant Webb as he examined the piece, said only, "Evened lace leaves, ashes, if one knows where to look." Chapter 6. The discovery of the scorched lace behind the museum boiler stirred the village more than the death itself. Someone tried to destroy evidence, Dora Maynard declared during tea, which proves there's a crime. Or someone was simply cold and careless, the vicar replied, reaching for another scone. But no one believed that. Not really, and certainly not Miss Marple. At first glance, it appeared to be a clumsy attempt at concealment. But Miss Marple understood something many did not. People didn't burn lace unless it meant something. Not just aesthetically, but personally. The fire wasn't about destruction. It was about erasure. The next day, Mrs. Petherbridge summoned Miss Marple under the pretense of discussing hymnals, though it quickly became clear her concerns had less to do with music and more with Edward Blake. "Jane, I don't mean to pry. Well, that's not true, I do. But have you noticed how Mr. Blake has taken over everything since Cordelia passed? He seems rather enthusiastic," Miss Marple offered. "Enthusiastic?" Mrs. Petherbridge threw up her hands. "He's gone through every drawer, reshuffled the inventory system, and cancelled next month's lecture on Belgian lace. Said it was irrelevant to the museum's mission. And do you know what else?" She leaned closer. "He was seen at the solicitor's office yesterday. No one knows why." Miss Marple made a polite noise of interest, but it nestled beside something sharper. Later that afternoon, she encountered Reverend Maynard in the churchyard, pruning the roses with quiet aggression. "I always thought Cordelia had a strange hold over the village," he said as he clipped. "Not affection exactly, But she knew things. Things people didn't want remembered. Such as, Miss Marple asked gently. He hesitated. Let's just say that museum records weren't the only things she kept. She had correspondence, photographs, a ledger of sorts. She never mentioned it to me. She wouldn't have. But once, during a charity meeting, I glimpsed it in her drawer. Names, dates, peculiar notations. She caught me looking and said, "Some truths need preserving, even if the people attached to them don't." "How very Cordelia," Miss Marple murmured. That evening, Agnes Bell returned to the museum briefly, under Webb's permission, to retrieve some personal items. Miss Marple met her there, and they walked the display room together, ghostly quiet without visitors. Agnes paused beside the now empty pedestal where the lace fan had once rested. She was going to send it for authentication. She said softly, to a contact in France, "I packed the parcel for her myself, but she never mailed it." "Why not?" Agnes shrugged. She said she wanted to confirm something first, about the donor. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Do you know who that was?" A pause. Agnes hesitated, then, "No. Only that it was someone local. Someone she referred to as an accidental thief." Miss Marple turned that over in silence. Someone who had ended up with a stolen item. Not knowingly, perhaps, but didn't return it once they learned the truth. Which suggested not just guilt, but fear. The next morning, Sergeant Webb came knocking again. "She was blackmailing someone," he said, dropping onto Miss Marple's garden bench with a grim expression. "That ledger Reverend Maynard mentioned, we found it, hidden under a loose floorboard in her office, locked but not very well. And code names mostly, but I think I've cracked one. Nightingale corresponds with some payments made last year from the museum's discretionary fund." Miss Marple blinked. Blackmail paid with museum money? That's ambitious. Cordelia Fawcett wasn't short on confidence. No, Miss Marple agreed. But perhaps she'd finally gone too far. By evening, village gossip had taken a sharp turn. Now it wasn't Agnes at the center, but Reverend Maynard. "Of course he was involved," whispered Mrs. Goodwin at the grocer's. "She had something on him. Probably a love child or gambling. The church accounts are never quite right, are they?" At the pub, two men debated whether Mr. Blake had a fake identity, while someone else swore they'd seen him on a ferry to Calais 2 winters ago. And over at Cresswell Stationery, a teenager claimed she once heard Agnes crying in the back room, saying, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." No one questioned why she'd been listening in the first place. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple watched the fire crackle low. She made a note in her journal, "Lace fan, timeline inconsistent." Cordelia feared exposure. Fan removed before death. Why? Accidental thief, just remorse. Ledger, just leverage, not legacy. Ashes don't lie, but they distract. She paused. Then beneath it, wrote one more line. What else was in that parcel? The next morning, Agnes came running up Miss Marple's walk, breathless, eyes wild. "They took it," she said. "Someone broke into Cordelia's desk last night. The parcel's gone." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if she'd expected nothing else. "Then we're closer than they'd like," she said. "Much closer." Chapter 7. It began with a locked door. By mid-morning, Edward Blake had failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with the museum board. A routine administrative gathering meant to discuss the upcoming winter exhibits, and that day, Temporary suspension of lace acquisition funding. Agnes waited outside the office with the spare keys. When he hadn't arrived by 10, she turned the lock. Inside, everything was still. The room looked untouched at first, papers aligned, books stacked, the faint scent of tobacco lingering in the air. But two things stood out. The window was open, and Blake's overcoat and briefcase were gone. Agnes stepped back, uneasy. She didn't call out. She didn't need to. Blake had vanished. By noon, Sergeant Webb stood in the middle of the office, one hand resting on the desk, the other on his hip. Coat, case, umbrella, all gone, he muttered. No note, no call, no messages. He wouldn't just leave, said Agnes, not without announcing his authority 5 times first. Webb gave a snort of agreement. Miss Marple, seated near the window, said nothing at first. Her eyes had fixed on a small porcelain cup left on the windowsill. Half-drunk tea, no lipstick, no sugar. A faint rim of yellowish residue near the base. This his? She asked softly. Webb followed her gaze. I imagine so. Still warm? Lukewarm, she said. He left in a hurry, but not without time to finish half a cup. She stood and paced once around the room, careful not to touch anything. Her eyes paused at the wall calendar. The date, circled in red ink, was today. Strange, she murmured. He didn't seem the sort to romanticize appointments. Webb pulled the calendar off the hook, flipping to the earlier pages. March had a scribbled note. F. Origin dispute resolved. April. Inventory issue. See Cordelia privately. And June. Nothing but an arrow pointing to the phrase, cover finalized. None of it meant anything yet. The village responded to Blake's disappearance with its usual brand of measured hysteria. He's run off with the funds, Mrs. Goodwin said flatly at the bakery. Took what he could and made for France. Or the fan, offered Mr. Nettleby from the watch repair shop. That thing's worth a fortune. Bet it was all planned. Or maybe Cordelia knew something about him. Dora Maynard whispered to Miss Marple at the church flower committee. Something old, something he couldn't afford to let out. Perhaps that ledger wasn't just names. Perhaps it was proof. Miss Marple did not argue. But her thoughts turned not to Blake's absence, but to his silence. If he'd truly fled, why hadn't he destroyed more? Why leave behind the ledgers? Why leave the tea? And what had he circled on today's date? That evening Sergeant Webb appeared at Miss Marple's cottage again. He looked less polished this time, his collar open, his shoes streaked with dirt. We found his car, he said without preamble. Abandoned behind the old greenhouse near Welbeck Farm. No tracks, no signs of struggle. Boot was empty. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. So, it's not escape, it's removal. Could be either, Webb said. He might have ditched it, or someone wanted it to look like he had, not it. Was anything found in the footwell? He paused. A few crumbs, dried grass, and a sliver of what looks like embroidered ribbon. Pale green, tucked under the brake. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-row. Ribbon? Yes, we sent it for testing. Might be decorative trim from something. Or lace edging, she murmured. Webb's eyes narrowed. The fan? Miss Marple set the needles aside. Perhaps not the fan, but connected to it. You recall the catalogue mentioned similar fans in the museum's possession. A set of 4, Cordelia only displayed one at a time. I thought she only brought one with her. So did everyone. The next morning, Agnes returned to the museum and unlocked the storage room with shaking hands. One by one, she and Miss Marple opened the protective drawers of the not on display collection. 3 drawers in, empty, the second fan, a mirror of the Chantilly lace one seen at the reception, was missing. Agnes sank onto the nearest bench. I didn't even know she kept it here. She always acted like the one was precious, unique. Miss Marple traced the groove where the case had sat. No one steals a second fan, she said softly, unless the first was a copy. By mid-afternoon, a letter arrived at the constable's office. No return address. Inside, a folded page, typed, "You are looking in the wrong direction. The past matters more than the museum." The fan was never Cordelia's to give. Beneath it, a single line in faint grey. "Ask the postmaster about 1947. Sergeant Webb read the letter aloud at Miss Marple's cottage. The 3 of them, Webb, Agnes and Miss Marple, sat in an uneasy triangle around the tea table. "Anonymous," he said. "Posted in Kingsmead. No prints. Could be a joke." "Or a reminder," Miss Marple said. "Someone wants us to turn the page. Backwards, not forward." Agnes frowned. "The postmaster's been there forever. Mr. Elcott. Retired 2 years ago." "Then we'll ask him." Miss Marple folded her napkin carefully. "And we must ask one more thing," she added. "If Cordelia never owned the fan, then who did?" Chapter 8. The retired postmaster, Mr. Lionel Elcott, lived in a modest cottage on the edge of Lower Fallow Lane, where ivy climbed the walls like gossip, and the gate creaked its own disapproval. He was a man of formidable eyebrows and mild tea, and when Sergeant Webb and Miss Marple arrived at 10:30, he was already seated in the conservatory, with a biscuit tin open and a pair of mismatched slippers at his feet. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, brightening. "Haven't seen you since the Christmas raffle." "Mr. Elcott," she replied warmly, "we're in need of your memory, and perhaps your honesty. 2 things that fade with age," he chuckled, "but do come in." Sergeant Webb remained standing as Miss Marple took a seat. The letter lay folded on the table between them. "We received an anonymous tip," Webb said, mentioning the year 1947 and your name. Elcott raised a brow. "Now, there's a year. Coldest winter in my memory. Half the village was snowed in. Took 3 days to dig out the vicar's spaniel." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Do you recall anything unusual being sent through the post? Perhaps something that changed hands in secret?" Elcott's fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the table. "You're talking about the parcel." Webb sat forward. "What parcel?" Elcott sighed. "We had a trunk go through. Early March. Brown, leather, foreign stamps, addressed to a Miss Vivian Gray." That name stuck, because there was no Vivian Gray in the village. I checked twice, and yet it was picked up. "By whom?" Miss Marple asked. Elcott looked at her. "Cordelia Fawcett." The room fell quiet. She claimed she was collecting on Miss Gray's behalf. I didn't think much of it at the time. The parcel was heavy. Too heavy for books. She signed for it, and that was that. But a week later, I found the label discarded behind the counter. The return address had been ripped off. Webb frowned. "And you didn't report it?" "To whom?" No one asked. It wasn't illegal to collect someone else's parcel if it was claimed properly. And Cordelia, well, she was the kind of woman who made people not ask questions. Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. "You said foreign stamps. France? Postmarked from Bayonne." Webb sat back. So Cordelia took possession of something not meant for her. Something sent from France, to someone who may never have existed, or someone who was never meant to receive it. Miss Marple added, "Want, in the village, word of Edward Blake's disappearance had begun to curl in on itself, morphing into folklore before the week had even ended. Interpol will catch him," Dora Maynard declared, as though she'd recently consulted with them. "There are only so many ports after all." Mrs. Goodwin now insisted she'd always thought he was not quite English. While Mr. Nettleby at the repair shop displayed a handwritten note reading, "Closed early today. Watching the roads." But Miss Marple's attention remained fixed, not on where Blake had gone, but on where the fan had come from. That afternoon, she returned to the museum alone. Agnes had agreed to allow her access to the archive room for an hour. Though she warned Miss Marple to step lightly, the floorboards are more dramatic than they ought to be. The archive room smelled of beeswax, linen, and the slow decay of secrets. Row after row of drawers lined the walls, each labeled with careful handwriting. Miss Marple's eyes landed on one in particular, Acquisition Records, 1946, 1952. She opened it carefully. Inside, a collection of index cards. Most were routine. Donor names, item descriptions, conditions upon delivery. But near the back, one card had a corner torn and a slightly different script. Item: lace fan, Chantilly pattern. Approx. 1860s. Gilded handle with pearl inlay. Source: private delivery via Miss Fiji. Provenance: unknown. Possible estate clearance, France. Condition: excellent lock mechanism repaired. Note: no display until further verification. There was no mention of Cordelia Fawcett, but tucked behind it was a folded piece of paper, thin, aged, and written in French. Miss Marple read the first line slowly. "À celle qui tient ce que je ne pouvais garder. Sachez que cela n'a jamais été vôtre. To the one who holds what I could not keep, know that it was never yours." She brought the document to Sergeant Webb that evening. "Can we date this?" he asked, turning the paper over in gloved hands. "Possibly. But more importantly, it tells us two things," Miss Marple replied. "First, that someone, perhaps Vivian Grey herself, knew the fan had been intercepted. And second, that the original owner never consented to its transfer." Webb exhaled, which means Cordelia had possession of stolen property for nearly 30 years. "And may have used it," Miss Marple added, "as leverage, as symbol, as threat." That night, as rain began to fall, Miss Marple stood by her window once more. She watched the dark shift across the hedgerows and the blurred street lamps beyond. The past had not just crept into the present. It had carved its initials in it. There were no screams, no violence, no signs of intrusion. Just a single object, passed hand to hand, carrying with it more than threads and patterns, carrying a betrayal. And now that object had disappeared again. Chapter 9. The solicitor's office sat just off Merton Lane, half hidden behind a crooked hedge and a wisteria-covered wall that hadn't been trimmed since the coronation. Inside, everything smelled faintly of parchment and peppermint lozenges. Mr. Leopold Smythe, the village solicitor for over 3 decades, greeted Miss Marple and Sergeant Webb with a short bow and a longer sigh. "I wondered how long it would take," he said, already reaching for the files. Cordelia wasn't the sort to go gently, even in paperwork. He produced a manila folder tied with red string. The top sheet bore the title, "Last Will and Testament of Cordelia Margaret Fawcett Executed. 3rd November, 1949 amended. 12th February, This year, Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "May we see the amendments?" she asked. Smythe slid a separate page across the desk. Not publicly filed yet, but the intention was clear. Webb leaned over to read aloud. Addendum. In the event of my death, I request that item number 12 from the Fallow Glen Lace Museum not be retained by the board. Instead, it shall be transferred to the care of Agnes Bell, to be disposed of as she sees fit. This instruction supersedes any previous claims of museum ownership. A silence fell. Miss Marple tapped the page lightly. She knew the fan wasn't hers to give. Webb nodded. She tried to correct it. Smythe cleared his throat. She didn't want it publicly known. Asked that the amendment be quietly included. No reading unless contested. I asked why. She said, because I've kept it too long already. And she named no donor, Miss Marple said. No, Smythe confirmed, but she said Agnes would know what to do. Outside the office, the wind had picked up. The village green rippled under long, thin clouds, and the steeple bell struck the quarter hour, as if to mark the change in tone. Sergeant Webb folded his hands behind his back as they walked. That changes everything. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. The fan was never meant for display, never hers by right, and Cordelia, at the end, tried to return it without scandal. Or before someone could stop her. Webb's expression darkened, which makes the disappearance of both the fan and Edward Blake more deliberate than ever. Miss Marple paused at the corner, where the cobblestones met the mossy path towards the museum. Tell me, Sergeant, what if Blake wasn't the thief? Webb frowned. He took control the moment she died, cleared records, hid evidence. That's not the behavior of an innocent man. No, she said, but it may be the behavior of a desperate one. Back at the museum, Agnes Bell was in the office, sorting through donations when Miss Marple entered. She looked up quickly, tension still etched into her face. I heard about the will, she said. Miss Marple nodded. She left you the fan. Agnes sat down slowly. I don't know what to do with that. She meant you to choose, Miss Marple replied. But perhaps the real gift wasn't the object, but the truth it forced her to face. Agnes looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me once, a few months ago, that keeping it, the fan had ruined something. Not the museum, not exactly, but her sense of being in the right. I didn't understand at the time. She lived with the guilt, Miss Marple said gently. That much is clear. There was a pause. Then Agnes said, if Blake didn't kill her, then who did? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked, do you know who Vivian Grey really was? Agnes's eyes widened. You found the name. She never existed, Miss Marple said. She was a shadow, a cover. Perhaps even Cordelia's own creation, meant to hide the original owner. But someone remembered. Someone sent that letter. Agnes hesitated. Then the fan wasn't just stolen. It was wanted back. That evening, a second envelope arrived. No postmark this time. Slipped under Sergeant Webb's office door. Inside was a photograph, sepia, curled at the corners. It showed a young woman, late 20s, hair swept into a formal wave, wearing a dark dress. In her gloved hands, the same lace fan. On the back, a single line. 1947. Dover, not Cordelia. Webb brought it to Miss Marple before dusk. She took one look and nodded. She's not English, she murmured. Look at the cut of the dress. Parisian. He squinted. You think she's the rightful owner? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, "We are dealing with a theft buried in time, and a crime born from trying to undo it too late." Webb set the photo on the table. "But that still doesn't explain Blake." "No," she agreed. "Unless Blake didn't vanish to escape, but to protect someone." That night, Agnes found a letter tucked into the folds of Cordelia's old ledger, hidden inside the back cover beneath loose binding thread. It was brief, unsigned, but unmistakably Cordelia's handwriting. "If they come looking, tell Jane. She will know how to untangle it. I thought I had time. I always thought there was more time." Chapter 10. It was a quiet morning when Miss Marple made her move. There were no announcements, no sudden accusations, just a soft suggestion, placed carefully, like a pin on silk. She visited the Lace Museum at 10, just as Agnes was unlocking the doors. They exchanged a look. No words were needed. Miss Marple had already spoken to Sergeant Webb. The plan was not a performance. It was an echo, a recreation of something that had already happened once before. By noon, the villagers had gathered. It wasn't uncommon for Miss Marple to host an afternoon tea, though it was rare for her to do so at the museum, and rarer still for the guest list to include everyone involved in the events of recent weeks. Dora and Reverend Maynard were there, stiff with anticipation. Mrs. Petherbridge came in her third-best hat, already whispering theories. Agnes Bell, pale but composed, stood quietly by the covered display case in the center of the room. And finally, as if summoned by rumor itself, Edward Blake entered, unannounced, untouched by travel, and still wearing his same navy overcoat. The gasp that followed his entrance was sharp enough to cut thread. "You're alive," Dora whispered. "Regrettably for some," Blake said dryly. He didn't look at Agnes. He looked at Miss Marple. "You sent the letter, didn't you?" he asked. "I did no such thing," Miss Marple said mildly. "But I expected you would receive one." Webb emerged from the archive room then, arms crossed, saying nothing. Blake's eyes narrowed, scanning the room. "So this is what? A confrontation?" "No," Miss Marple said. "It's an unveiling." Agnes, wordlessly, lifted the cloth from the display case. Inside was the original lace fan, unburned, unbroken, unhidden. There was a collective intake of breath. "I don't understand," Mrs. Petherbridge said. "She said it had been destroyed," Dora murmured. Miss Marple smiled. "Did she?" She turned to the room. "This fan," she said, "was not found in the archives, nor was it discovered among Cordelia's belongings. It was returned by someone who believed it too dangerous to keep and yet too important to destroy." She let her words sink in. The original theft occurred in 1947. The fan was sent to someone named Vivian Gray, who never received it. Cordelia claimed it, whether opportunistically or guiltily, we may never know. But what we do know is this: the fan was never officially recorded under her name, and yet she used it repeatedly as leverage, which is why she left it to Agnes. Webb added quietly, to right what she couldn't fix while alive. Blake stepped forward. His face was calm, but a tremor ran through one hand. And didn't kill her." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You feared you'd be blamed." "I knew what she was doing. I tried to stop her. I tried to convince her to come forward, to release the fan quietly. But she refused. She said she'd made too many enemies to trust any of us with the truth." "She was right," Miss Marple said softly. He looked at her. "So, why am I here?" Miss Marple gestured toward the fan. "To see who would react." It happened quickly, too quickly to be called drama. A simple intake of breath. A sound. From the back of the room, Reverend Maynard's hand shot to his mouth, knocking his teacup from its saucer. I didn't know," he stammered. All heads turned. The silence that followed was not shock. It was recognition. A click of truth falling into place. Miss Marple stepped closer. "You were the one who gave Cordelia the contact in Dover. The one she used to trace the fan's origin. But you also knew what she'd found. And more than that, you knew who had originally owned it." Maynard took a step back. "That's not true. You were stationed in France, weren't you? After the war, helped process estate recoveries." Dora turned, her mouth slightly open. "Giles?" He looked at her. Then slowly, to Miss Marple. "She blackmailed me," he said finally. "She said if I didn't keep her secret about the fan, she'd reveal what I did." "What did you do?" Webb asked. Maynard's voice was barely a whisper. "I falsified one certificate. One. A lace parcel came through my station. A luxury item from a confiscated estate. I signed it off as abandoned. I thought no one would care. The family had vanished. It was wartime. I didn't think it would matter." "But it did," Miss Marple said. "Cordelia kept the fan, but not the secret. She kept it as a weapon. She called it leverage," Maynard said bitterly. "Told me if I didn't keep quiet about the parcel, she'd ruin me. I'm a vicar, for God's sake." "Even vicars have pasts," Miss Marple replied. Webb took a step forward. "Did you kill her, Reverend?" "No," he said immediately. "I was afraid of what she might say, yes. But I didn't poison her. I didn't even see her that day. I swear it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps you didn't," she said. "But someone made sure that Cordelia's secret was buried again, and not just hers." She looked once more around the room. "Because the real killer," she said calmly, "still hasn't spoken." Chapter 11. The silence following Miss Marple's statement was not the hush of confusion. It was the hush of attention. Every eye in the room searched the others, measuring movements, waiting for a flicker, a cough, a tremor that might mean guilt. But Miss Marple was not watching the crowd. She was watching Agnes Bell. Agnes stood still by the fan display. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, her face unreadable. Only her eyes moved, slowly, cautiously, from Reverend Maynard to Edward Blake, then to Miss Marple. "Shh!" Marple's voice was soft, almost companionable. "Cordelia Fawcett lived surrounded by secrets, but secrets like lace leave patterns, and when something doesn't match, one must ask why." She stepped toward the center of the room. The fan she displayed was not the original. That fan, the authentic one, was taken before the reception, replaced with a near-identical replica. The switch, I believe, happened 2 days before the reopening. Just long enough for Cordelia to realize it, and just long enough for someone else to panic. Edward Blake spoke, his voice tight. But only she and Agnes had keys. Miss Marple turned slowly. Indeed, all eyes shifted. Agnes said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle, even now. "Cordelia left the fan to you in her will. She trusted you, Agnes, but perhaps she didn't know you as well as she believed." Agnes's lips parted slightly. "I didn't," she began, but stopped. Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. "You found out the truth about the fan before Cordelia did, didn't you? Somewhere during your inventory work last winter. You matched the old photographs. You saw the date on the repair invoice. You realized the object everyone believed was a proud donation was actually a war relic smuggled through deceit. Agnes blinked rapidly, but said nothing. You didn't intend to kill her, Miss Marple said gently. At first, I think you only wanted to take the fan, to send it where it belonged, perhaps to return it anonymously. But Cordelia surprised you by amending her will and planning to give it to you anyway. She wanted to make things right, in her own proud, complicated way. Miss Marple paused, letting the truth settle. But you couldn't wait. You thought she would change her mind. You thought she'd display it again, claim it as her own. So you acted. Agnes's voice, when it came, was hoarse. No one knew what she was. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Except you. Sergeant Webb stepped forward, not with handcuffs, but with hesitation. Agnes Bell, he said quietly. Do you understand what's being said? Agnes didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Miss Marple. She lied, she said, to everyone. For decades, she built her reputation on a stolen artifact, blackmailed the vicar, threatened Blake, and all the while she talked about preservation, as if she were the custodian of virtue itself. You put the digitalis in her tea, Miss Marple said softly. Small doses, enough to build up, subtle, delayed. Agnes gave a small, broken laugh. She never let anyone else touch her cup, not even me, except for one evening. She was distracted. She'd just finished writing that blasted will clause. I saw the document on her desk. She didn't even mention it. Just poured the tea, left the tin open, as if nothing had changed. And that was enough, Miss Marple said. One slip, one gesture of trust. Agnes's hands dropped to her sides. She would have kept lying, she said. She would have taken it all to her grave and smiled doing it. But she didn't, Miss Marple said. She tried to return it. You just didn't believe. She meant to. A long silence followed. Webb didn't reach for her. Not yet. Agnes finally looked up. Her eyes, red-rimmed, were not angry. They were tired. Later that evening, as the guests were quietly dismissed and Sergeant Webb accompanied Agnes to the station, Miss Marple remained at the museum a while longer. The fan had been returned to its display case, this time without ceremony. She stood alone beside it, the lacework glowing faintly under the overhead lights. There was beauty in it still, but no longer pride, just history, and the weight of choices made long ago. Edward Blake reappeared beside her, hands in his pockets. She fooled us all, he said. Even me. Miss Marple nodded once. Cordelia wasn't cruel, just frightened of being discovered, of being ordinary. And Agnes? She was trying to be righteous, Miss Marple said, and in doing so, committed the worst sin Cordelia ever did. She believed she knew better than everyone else. As she left the museum, a wind had picked up. It rattled the hedges, stirred the old church bell, shifted the leaves like whispers. Miss Marple paused at the gate, one gloved hand resting on the iron latch. And for the first time since the beginning, the village felt quiet again, but not peaceful. No, not quite. Chapter 12. The inquest was held in the village hall 3 days later. No fanfare, no reporters, just a collection of worn chairs, polished shoes, and faces that wore their solemnity like borrowed coats. Agnes Bell confessed to administering digitalis to Cordelia Fawcett over a 3-week period. It had not been her plan, she insisted. She had intended to return the fan in secret, to protect the museum's reputation. and spare the village embarrassment. But Cordelia's silence, her refusal to explain herself, had twisted that good intention into something brittle and poisoned. The verdict was manslaughter, and Agnes was to be held until the Crown reviewed the full investigation. But in Fallow Glen, it wasn't the legal outcome that haunted people. It was the motive. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat with Sergeant Webb in the warm quiet of her sitting room. A new fire had been lit. The lace curtains danced faintly in the breeze. "You were right," Webb said. "It wasn't just a crime. It was a culmination." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. Agnes was angry, but not cruel. She thought she was correcting a wrong. But in the end, she mirrored the very thing she condemned: possession. She thought the fan would clear her conscience, and, in the end, Miss Marple murmured, it did the opposite. She opened her notebook and turned back to the beginning. "I should have seen it earlier," she said, "but the clues were too clean, too orderly. Blake's disappearance, Cordelia's will, the burned lace, all designed to shift our focus." Webb leaned forward. "Let's walk it through, just once more, the full thing." Miss Marple smiled. "If you insist." She began with the fan. Cordelia acquired it in 1947 under suspicious circumstances. It was never hers. That much became clear once we traced the name Vivian Grey. An alias, or perhaps a ghost, linked to a French estate. The fan was part of a private shipment that never arrived at its intended recipient. She took it, Webb said, and built a legacy on it. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. And then, perhaps years later, began to regret it. Or perhaps feared she'd be exposed. She amended her will, not to be generous, but to prevent a scandal. By leaving it to Agnes, she hoped to close the chapter. But Agnes had already read the book. Webb muttered. Miss Marple continued. Agnes discovered the fan's origin months before Cordelia's death. She tried to do what Cordelia never had the courage to, give it back. But Cordelia kept delaying. She refused to acknowledge wrongdoing, even to Agnes. And so Agnes, frustrated, bitter, and perhaps feeling righteous, made a decision. She poisoned her slowly, Webb said, so no one would suspect. And it almost worked, Miss Marple said, until Blake disappeared. Webb frowned. Do you believe him now? That he ran to protect someone? I believe he ran to protect himself from becoming the scapegoat. He feared what Agnes might do next, and perhaps he feared what secrets Cordelia's ledgers might reveal about him. Webb was silent. Miss Marple continued softly. And then there was Reverend Maynard. Webb nodded. Cordelia blackmailed him. But he didn't kill her. No, she said, but she held power over many people. And when power is built on silence, it only takes one person asking the right question to bring the whole house down. She closed the notebook gently. The fan was never about art. It was about control, and secrets, and guilt. The next morning, the Lace Museum remained closed. A sign hung on the door, written in Agnes's careful script. Temporarily closed for recataloguing. Please respect the past. Few villagers passed by. Inside, the fan had once again been locked away. This time not in glass, but in a sealed archival drawer labeled Provenance Disputed, not for display. On her walk home, Miss Marple paused by the rose garden in front of the vicarage. Dora Maynard was tending to the petals in silence. She was always so precise. Dora murmured, not looking up. Cordelia, always pruning everyone else's branches. I suppose eventually someone decided she needed cutting back. Miss Marple didn't reply. She simply knelt, picked up a fallen petal, and placed it gently on the soil. That evening, she returned to her sitting room. The fire had burned low. Her knitting lay forgotten in a basket by the hearth. She opened her drawer and removed the photo sent anonymously. The young woman holding the fan in 1947. She'd never learned the woman's name. Some stories, even solved, buns left corners in shadow. She placed the photo back in its envelope, and then she turned out the light. End of chapter 12, and end of the mystery.